Okay, we should be live. We can maybe wait a second, let some people join, but I'll go ahead and do my part. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Facebook today. We've got authors James Lee Burke and Lee Child here. We were just talking about how the last time that James Lee Burke was here was in '97, and I think Lee Child was here in 2009. We've picked both of them for our first editions club before, and that's, I think, why y'all were here during that time. But I was just saying that it's nice that even though it's virtual, we have you both back again. I'm gonna do a short intro for both of y'all, but I was also gonna explain to everybody on Facebook, if you would like to ask a question while they're having their in conversation portion, you can just comment that below and I'll pop back in at the end and we'll try to, answer as many questions as we can. All right, let's see here. Okay, so I've written some stuff down. Lee Child is the author of 24 New York Times bestselling Jack Reacher thrillers, with 15 having reached the #1 position, and the #1 bestselling complete Jack Reacher story collection, No Middle Name. He's a native of England and a former television director, and he currently lives in New York City, although I think I just found out that he's been living in Wyoming for, the past 6 months, I think. And then also Lee has a new book coming out in October called The Sentinel. And I'm going to put a link if you'd like to pre-order from us. We'll put that down there. James Lee Burke is a New York Times bestselling author, 2-time winner of the Edgar Award, and the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts in Fiction. A Private Cathedral is his 40th book, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I'm going to pass it over to Lee and let y'all just go ahead and be in conversation. Sounds good?
Yeah. It sounds great.
All right.
Thank you, Hillary. That was a lovely introduction, and it is great to be with you all. I know that Jim and I both wish that we were actually there in person. Touring for books is something that you kind of enjoy, but it certainly is stressful and tiring with the travel. But this year, I think we would all just eat it up to be back on the road and seeing some live people. Right, Jim?
That's right.
And I have to say, what a pleasure and a privilege this is. One of the most amazing things about becoming a writer is that all writers are primarily readers, first and foremost. So we've been reading for years. Then we become writers. And if we're lucky enough to become successful, then we get a chance to meet our heroes. And this is unbelievable to me. I read James Lee Burke from afar with wonderment and admiration. And then being in the business, we met and hung out and we had dinner and stuff like that. And that is absolutely better than the money and the women and the swimming pools and the fast cars. That is the best part about being a success.
Well, thank you very much, Lee. That's a great honor.
So this is a big milestone, obviously, 40th book in a career that started, by my calculations, 55 years ago in the 60s, right?
Yeah, even longer than that. I published my first story when I was 19, and Lordy, I can't even remember how long ago that was. A couple of, 100 years, I guess. Yeah.
Well, a very different world, and we'll get into that, I think. But what is epic about your career is a measure of early success and acclamation, and then the famous, the legendary period where you were not published for more than a decade. Yeah. And so in a sort of Greek tragedy type of a way, I think that was partly inevitable. It must have been somewhat frustrating, I guess. Maybe taught you some things, but does it occur to you now that you were too young for those first few books? Did age and wisdom do the trick, or was it something else altogether?
Well, it'd be hard for me to say. I never figured it out. Yes, I finished my first novel, Half of Paradise, when I was 23 years old. And then I published 2 more books with quite a bit of at least critical success. The next book that I submitted to New York was The Lost Get Back Boogie, and it went under submission for 9 years with my current agent, Philip Spitzer. I met Philip during that period, and it was rejected 111 times. And I wrote other things during that period. But anyway, finally, I listened to my wife, who said, send it to LSU Press. And they published it, and it was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize.
So the moral of that story is always listen to your wife. Well, funnily enough, Stephen King has a similar story, that he was with Carrie. He was despondent and dispirited about it, and didn't want to finish it. And of course, back in those days, we all used paper drafts, and there would only be one draft of a thing. And he threw it in the trash. And his wife pulled it back out again and said, no, get on with it. So yeah, we should listen to our wives.
Yeah, and it was really hard to write a novel physically back then. Remember, with carbon paper, typing it on a small Smith Corona, and then being scared to death that it would be lost in the mail. Because I remember when I was submitting my first novel, Xeroxing cost 25 cents a page, which was an awful lot of money then. In other words, you had to get poor and in order to be a success.
Yeah, the physical equipment was, I had a typewriter, absolutely, the same thing, a little portable one. My grandma bought it for me. And I'm not sure why, because she passed away before, just literally as I was starting to write my first book. So she never knew that it worked, but she had bought me this typewriter, which I did not actually use for the first book. I wrote the first book in pencil. And, but I do remember borrowing my daughter's inkjet printer in order to send it off. It took a day and a half to print a novel on that thing. So yeah, it was a big struggle, and then walked down to the post office with the manuscript and all of that. It is so different now. I'm sure it's the same for you, but I never see paper anymore until the first time I see the book in paper is when it comes out in the store.
Well, I asked a fellow when I was first hearing about computers, what was the difference between typing on my old Smith Corona and buying one of these computers. And he said, it's the difference between you building the pyramids with your bare hands rather than machines.
Yeah. I assume you use a computer now.
Yeah, yes. I write a lot in longhand, though. I keep a tablet by my bedside, and I often get up about 4 in the morning and write some things, and then pick it up earlier, later on in the day.
I'm really interested in how the method affects the result, because there's a lot of talk. There's the Italian writer and critic Umberto Eco. Just before he died, his last essay was about the Italian government had abandoned formal handwriting in schools. And he was very upset about that, because he felt to write formally by hand meant that you cast the sentence first and then wrote it, and it was probably a better sentence. Whereas computers mean that you can just do whatever you want and you're going to change it later. Have you found it's made a difference?
Yeah, I think I didn't know that quote. That's a tremendous quote. I believe that too, that calligraphy and the written word are that. And we've lost something along the way. There's a much more careless attitude just in general about communication. I mean, very often you can look on the monitor, or I guess that's what the screen, whatever it is, email coming in, and the typing is awful. the punctuation is gone. It's kind of a slur on the language. I remember something that George Orwell said in his essay, Why I Write. He said, writing is an extension, how did he put it? An extension of thought. And thought is an extension of a vocal enunciation. And he said, ultimately, the unity of the human intellect is bound inextricably with reason. And I never thought about it in that way. In other words, this is, an idea that Voltaire could have come up with. But I think we've fragmented language today. I think the English language, at least, has stepped into a period that is to me, it's very troubling. It's simplistic, and I don't know. It's like kind of, well, I don't know. I probably older people say things like this. I'm not envious of the culture today.
No, I find it, I do worry about being the old guys shouting, get off my lawn, to all these people that IT' for the possessive seems to be a lost cause now, and it's a horrible thing to read all the time. So I worry about being the old guy, crotchety old curmudgeon. But on the other hand, I admire, I grew up in a manufacturing city where people made things, and they used tools with tremendous precision in order to produce the desired result. And words are our tools. They're all we've got. And to see them used carelessly and inexactly is upsetting, but also existentially pointless, because if we don't use words in an agreed manner, then we're not communicating at all.
Well, I think that's true.
So don't forget what Hillary said at the beginning. If you're watching on Facebook, and I guess there is no other way of watching this, so you are watching it on Facebook, if you got questions, type them in the comments field, and she will relay them and we will answer them. So I guess, here's one of the dumbest questions that we ever get. When you started Dave Rober's show with the Neon Rain, you could not possibly have known he would still be going in 2020, and you would have, you'd be publishing, I don't know how, is it 26 or something in Rober Show novels? 23. 23, okay, good, because that's one less than I've done Reacher novels, so at least I'm ahead of you in something. So when you did the first one, did you have any sense that it was a series that would continue, or was it just a one-off story?
I did not, but the evolution of the initial Rober Show book is interesting, because I never saw the level of success coming that indeed would occur. I had been out of print in the middle of my career 13 years, and not only had the Lost Get Back Boogie been rejected 111 times during the time that Philip Spitzer was submitting it, a large agency had it for a while and couldn't sell it. I was fishing with Rick DeMarinis in Montana, and Rick was a very good writer, and he said, Jim, you've written every kind of book. Why don't you try a crime novel? And 3 days later, Pearl and I and Alifair, our daughter, were in San Francisco, and I was up there by Ferlin Yeti's bookstore, City Lights. I bought a yellow legal tablet and walked up to a outdoor cafe. It's an Italian restaurant, and it's right across from the Catholic church there. And I sat down and started writing in longhand. And I wrote and typed 2 chapters, and I typed them back then. And I sent them to my friend, Charles Williford, down in Miami. And Charles wrote me back, and he said, Jim, I think you may have created one of the best protagonists in the history of crime music, crime fiction. He said, you've got a song here. Don't let go of it. And so this, remember again, I've been receiving rejections for 13 years. These were not only rejections. The Lost Get Back Boogie was literally vandalized. This is not exaggeration. It had been stabbed with a ballpoint pen. There were whiskey rings all around the margins. One fellow, I won't mention his name or the publishing house, was so upset. He wrote this long, indignant letter of rejection. He referred to the two protagonists as two F-ups. He said, this is what he said. He said, this might make a good Steve McQueen or Burt Reynolds script, but that's about it. And I thought, what's wrong with the Burt Reynolds, Steve McQueen script? What universe am I in? Anyway, a lady retyped it for me, and then it went to a publisher, and I could not believe it. I got an advance, and LSU Press helped me out though immensely. They really resurrected my career. I had a whole box of rejection slips, and I was going to one day sign them and then auction them off, and I lost the box.
That's a shame, because that would be a fabulous collection. I mean, that was back in the day when people would do that. I don't know why they did that. I mean, why not just say no? What's the point of writing a huge long essay about something they're not going to publish? It's a story that should go down with, in 1962, Brian Epstein, manager of a completely unknown new pop group called the Beatles, took their audition tapes to Decca Records in London. A producer called Derek Rowe played the tapes, and Rowe said, no thanks, I think the days of guitar groups are over.
That's like being looking at the invention of the wheel and shaking your head, saying it'll never
Yeah. Or that famous story about Thomas Watson of IBM, at the end of World War II, all the military developments in computing were handed over to the civilian industry. And Watson was asked to compile a report. Was there a market for such a thing as a computer? And he labored on this for months and came to the conclusion, yes. He thought possibly they could sell 14 computers globally. So yeah, people's predictions are terrible. But and yeah, Robichaud was a revolutionary character, fresh, new, attractive in his unattractiveness in a lot of ways. The classic dysfunctional anti-hero. And I always, people say to me about Reacher, what did I want him to be? And I said I didn't want him to have any of those dysfunctions, because I felt that people had piled in after you with a kind of inflation that just made the character nuts. Robichaud is a solid 100% organic character. But if you copy him, you've got to make him more. And so subsequent writers were doing these more dysfunctional heroes, these miserable, depressed guys that could barely drag themselves from one page to the next. And I always felt that was unattractive. We don't want to read about miserable people, whereas Robichaud just hits it right. Was that just completely instinctive? You were just writing an instinctive portrayal?
Well, in one sense, yes. I have, and this sounds kind of self-congratulatory, the benefit of a classical education. There's no such thing as a classical education anymore. The great advantage of having a classical education is that people think it's all brand new. But that said, this is the belief I have about both the human condition and all art. it goes back to the ancient world. Our antecedents were much more wise than we give them credit for being. And the egalitarian knight that, in effect, is the character I wanted to write about, Dave Robichaux, has his origins back there in the golden age of Pericles. We also find him in the Arthurian legend, also in Elizabethan theater, and also in the Bible. All the great stories of antiquity replicate themselves again and again and again. Why? Because as the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung said, it seems that we inherit racial or genetic memory. It's stored there in that 90% of the mind we call the unconscious. And I always remember the words of Milton about his blindness. He said, he woke at dawn to darkness, and his hours of illumination in which he wrote Paradise Lost were the only times he saw light and it's the only time that great creativity came to him. But Shakespeare put it another way. He said, all power lies in the world of dreams. And that's what made these men great artists, all women who are great artists. It's because they go into a place, a reservoir of experience that is ultimately the quintessential soul of the human race. So art and spirituality, in my mind, are inseparable.
I had the same experience with the classical education because I was educated in England at a very ancient school. In fact, it gave me one of my most satisfying lines of my life. I was, for some reason, at an event at the New York Yacht Club, which is without a doubt the most snobby institution that you have ever seen. And there was a woman there whose grandson, I guess, had just gotten into one of those New England academies, maybe Phillips or something like that. And she was so proud and pleased. And she looked at me thinking, obviously I was some kind of scumbag. And she said, where did you go to school? Expecting me to say PS 20 in the Bronx or something like that. And I said, ma'am, the school I went to is 224 years older than the United States. And it cleaved to that classical curriculum. Nothing after the year 1485 was ever discussed because that was dangerously modern, practically journalism. And so it was all classical. And my epiphany was one day in school, we were reading Ovid's life of Theseus. Which is just a great story. And on the bus home, I was reading Dr. No by Ian Fleming. And it struck me, obviously, that those are exactly the same stories. Every beat is identical. So yeah, the ancients invented it all. They sussed it out. And I think all we can do, especially in crime fiction, all we can do is cleave to the myth that they established thousands of years ago. The noble loner, the man who lives to his own code, which then begs the question, why? Why has that survived so long? Well, I think because we need it.
I think it also is, I agree with you. It also has to do, I think, with a nation's experience, and that civilization has always followed the sun. The man who spoke those words to me was Dr. John Neihart, who wrote Black Elk Speaks. He was my first poetry creative writing teacher, and I learned an enormous amount from him. But he always maintained that the Western world was in its decline and that the East, Asia, was on the rise. And he said these to me, he said these things to me back in the 1950s. I think probably all ancient literature has to do with the hunters. Even the Grail, the story of the Grail, may have, depends on which or anthropologist you read. But the Celtic notion of a golden bowl that was forever filled with nutrition, and the galloping of horses across the thunderheads of the clouds, that legend goes back probably very long and before Christianity, which is not to take away from the Christian legend. My point is, and again, this is one person's view of things, the center of Western civilization is based on two myths, and myths in the old world were not, that was not a pejorative. A myth meant a metaphorical understanding of the human experience. The myth of the Arthurian legend, the search for the Grail, and the wonderful story of my heaven, the Road to Roncevaux, the Song of Roland, the Song of Roland. That's it. All the great works about the American West are predicated on those two sources. Shane appears from the East, out of nowhere, the man with no name. It's Alan Ladd's greatest role. The personification of evil is sitting there in the saloon in the form of Jack Wilson, played by Jack Palance, a man who has about 3 lines in the whole script. He sits behind a table with a dead hand-rolled cigarette in his mouth, drinking coffee. But you know, he's the devil incarnate. But here's the point, the last scene of that movie, and I believe that movie was one of the best ever made. And my friend A.B. Guthrie wrote the screenplay for it. In the last scene, the little boy, remember, played by Brian, golly Moses, anyway, the little boy is running after Shane, calling out his name, Shane, Shane, Shane. But Shane has already passed the chalice and turned to the boy and turned him into the light bearer. It's the same story, but rather than a replication though, it oftentimes gives us a clarity of mind about what is the charge that we have. And say, we look around us, and I'm always reminded of the words of, the man who wrote The Golden Bough, James, golly Moses, one of the greatest anthropologists who ever lived and who wrote some of the greatest prose. The great cathedral is out there in the woods with these enormous trees that early man found himself under, with these pillars of light coming down through the foliage. It is that reverence for the earth that we've forgotten. We have, in one way or another, convinced ourselves, and through, I think, a kind of just maniacal, self-destructive process, that we were given the earth to use it as we will. And it's a terrible mistake. And well, I don't mean to, golly Moses. All right, so that's it.
That is, though, very apparent living in the West, is the apparent infinite abundance of the land, and yet it is used hard. But the thing that I loved about Shane retrospectively, the book rather than the movie, is that the guy who wrote the book, Schaefer, never went further west than Cincinnati in his life.
Really?
And yeah, he never saw it. He never actually experienced it. Shane, as a book, was a work of pure imagination. And it always fascinates me how imagination can capture the truth in some ways while simultaneously creating the truth. Because there's no question that the American West's image of itself has at least partially been created by media, by representation of it, which is immensely reassuring to me. You know, I write about a guy from the US Army, and I'm neither from the US nor the Army, but you can create it by imagination, and people believe it, because obviously on these type of tours, we always try to go to a PX or something like that, you know, to show appreciation to the people in the military. And occasionally I work up my courage and you know, somebody says, oh, they love Reacher. And I say, is it like that in the Army? Do you think it's plausible? And they say, well, not in my unit, but I assume in some other unit. So the power of suggestion is huge. The other thing that I really want to know about is the latest, The Private Cathedral, is a prequel or flashback or whatever you want to call it, set at a time in the past when the characters are younger than they ought to be in the front story. Why was that? Why do that now in this particular go around?
Yes, well, the book, A Private Cathedral, is the third one in a trilogy. The first book in that trilogy is titled just Robichaux. The second book is The New Iberia Blues, and the third is The Private Cathedral. The story is set back in the time just before 9/11. And it's been my belief for many years that a presence of some kind was about to manifest itself into our national life. I have felt this all my life, maybe because of where I grew up. But since the 1830s, we have had an element at work in our culture that is called Nativism. It was first an enormous prejudice toward Irish immigration in the 30s and the 40s during the years of the famine. But that characteristic in our culture has ebbed and flowed and receded, and we have stoked it periodically, the 1890s, the 1920s, then again in the 1950s. And there has always been that antagonist at work, that canker in the rose in America, in American democracy. This is not a denigration of our culture. It is just, I think, a realistic view of it. There has been that tendency at time to allow what we used to call vigilantism to have its way. We always find a way to justify it, but it means the abandonment of civilization. And we've had three demagogues, in my view, in the 20th century who were the antecedents of a figure that I believed was forthcoming somewhere someone in the 21st century. But the first was Huey Long. He was the demagogue in denim. And he had a magical way of dealing with people and taking what was worst in them and maybe manipulating it but I don't want to get into Huey Long. He was an amateur in comparison to those who followed him. Then we had George Wallace and Joseph McCarthy. I believe these people, again, were just the early arrival of something far, far worse. I'm not sure where we are today. I don't know that these defects in the human character will all be personified or embodied in one individual. Maybe it will be just a state of mind, but I think we're on the brink of it. I think it's right there on the edge of things. Look, the rise of nationalism began with the early Reformation, the breakaway of the German baronies from the Holy Roman Empire, the time of, Martin Luther. I'm not blaming Martin Luther for things, but anyway, nationalism seemed to be fading, coming to an end, but it's back. And it's back. You can hear the boots on the cobblestones. Just as a small glimpse of things. I had quite an awakening. I enrolled in a summer course at the University of Madrid in 1959. That was the first year in which Franco allowed foreigners to enter the country, but it was a fascist country, the real deal. And I stayed in the international hostel there right off of the Grand Via. And every morning, these fellows in stormtrooper dress, they wear the bucket helmets, they carried Schmeitzers, machine guns, and Mauser rifles, and they went goose stepping right by I could see them not far away, but it was those feet you'd hear hammering into the cobblestones, and they were people you didn't mess with. And I thought, this is the real thing. It was like a dream at first, but it doesn't. What does it take to tip people over the edge, to become lemmings? I've never figured it out. I have never figured it out. I was a newspaper reporter. I met some really powerful people, and on every occasion, without exception, people with power who frightened others. And you thought you were about to meet the Antichrist and discovered you were talking with Elmer Fudd. I'm not exaggerating. I think people who couldn't put building blocks together, who can talk people into scenarios that are absolutely lunatical. How it's done, God only knows. But anyway, that's just one guy's impression of things.
Did you find it, detail to detail? Did you like writing about 20 years ago in the sense of, because I do, I got to admit it, and I think the reader prefers things to be behind the curve in terms of technology and so on. And from a writer's point of view, I think it's kind of pointless to be writing this year's technology, because you know perfectly well by the time the book comes out next year that it'll be out of date. So I find it comforting to write the past rather than the present, because I understand it better, to be honest.
Well, the past, of course, is our great teacher, and often, who was it, the philosopher who said, if we ignore history, we are doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's hope we're not doomed to repeat it, but let's check in with Hillary. Do we have any questions yet? Do we have anything?
We do.
Good.
I'll just kind of go through, pick and choose a little bit here, but someone did ask, Tim asked if we'll ever see Dave and Reacher join forces.
I would, that's one of the ongoing perpetual pleasures about this genre. You can pick a pair of characters and imagine them together. And yeah, at least that is a very nice way of asking the question. Usually we get the dumb way: who would win in a fight, Dave or Reacher? And of course, the perpetual answer to that question is they wouldn't have a fight. They would recognize such similarity in each other that they would probably go for a cup of coffee instead. And but I would love, short story maybe. It would be hard to sustain a whole novel collaborating, but a short story would be fun. There are loads of awkward legal things like copyright, and we have different publishers and this and that. But if we get past the procedure, it would be a riot. I would love it.
Well, I've always had the same experience with my characters. I try to tell them where to go, and they take on their own agenda for the book. So I don't think I know this for a fact. I've never written a book and with any notion at all about its direction or how it would end. And it's usually all the way down to the last script, but the last pages. But I've never thought about a collaboration, and it's a really interesting idea. But I hate to admit this. I know, and it sounds like humility. Unfortunately, it's not. I've never had any control over what I wrote. I don't know where the stories come from. And again, this sounds peculiar, that I have what are in effect non-chemically induced blackouts. And I have many things I don't remember writing. I do not remember writing them. It's like There are two people I know or know of who said something quite similar, and I don't compare the gift that I have, but I call it a gift because I did not acquire it of my own accord. But William Faulkner, right before his death, said, had I not written the books, someone else would have written them for me. And Ernest Hemingway, not before he took his life, said he reread The Old Man in the Sea. And he said, it was very strange to me. It was as though I had not written it. But I think, see, this is again, which is what I feel. I believe that an artist, doesn't matter what kind, a musician or a sculptor or a poet, knows the gift comes from somewhere else. And for that reason, it's votive in nature. Robert Frost said that. And he said, you never stain it. It's the one, you can do all the other things. Just, turn your life into a garbage dump, but you never stain the gift because it's there for a purpose. And I know people sometimes ask, about what advice would one give a young writer or a young artist of any kind? You never quit. That's it. If you believe in your gift, you just don't quit because it's there for a reason.
I actually have a question from John, and he was asking about the origins of your characters, Dave and Cleet, and just how their friendship, how you created that friendship. I think it's like a 20-year-long friendship.
Well, I really, again, I don't think I created it, but I appreciate the question. In the Neon Rain, the first book in the series, Cleet does some really underhanded things, and their friendship is fractured, and it isn't healed, the damage done, until 2 books later, and that is in the Black Cherry Blues. But Cleet is a very mixed kind of character. Actually, again, it's the classical world, the story. Cleet is a character out of the medieval legend of the trickster, the fellow that is always up to no good, the man who's just absolutely out of control. How does Dave Robichaud describe him? A man whose life had a man whose life was similar to a junkyard falling down a staircase. But he is a great character. But the 2 men are opposite sides of the same coin, but they form a person. One, it's like Sancho Panza and Don Quixote, the idealist coupled with the hedonist. But they're a great pair, and they represent what's best in America, I think. They're both blue-collar men, but they have, again, the vision of the Arthurian knight.
Let's see. I've got a question from Carol. Did either of you have a particular inspiration for your main characters?
Well, I'm a bit like Jim in that I don't know how I do the book, and I don't want to know. To me, it's an organic process that starts somewhere, and I literally do not know what's going to happen in the next line. Certainly don't know what's going to happen in the story as a whole. And I kind of approach the origins of Reacher in the same way, that he sprang out fully formed as he was in the first book. And I was very reluctant to examine why and how that had happened, just in case I broke the bubble somehow. So it was many years before I really allowed myself to think about it. And in terms of what he's based on, clearly, like I said at the very beginning, all writers are predominantly readers. Typically I do 1 book a year, but I read hundreds of books a year. I'm hundreds of times more of a reader than a writer. And so the character obviously comes from what I've read, which stretches back thousands of years now in all those various aspects that we talked about. The the mythic hero from our distant past, the Western hero, the Cold War hero. They're all the same character. And so Reacher just came out, my version of that. And it was literally a decade before I allowed myself to even think about it because I didn't want to screw it up.
James, what about you? Or you kind of already said some of that, I feel like.
Charles Willeford gave me a suggestion when I was writing The Neon Rain. Charles said, say less. So you let your protagonist say less. And I started thinking about that. And it's very interesting, and I don't know that my conjecture is well founded, but the Clint Eastwood character, Dirty Harry, he never speaks before he does anything, but he sends a signal to the audience in the theater. There's that sudden blank look in his face, which means the bad guys are about to get blown out of their socks. The audience starts to snicker every time. And this, I don't know if you know Clint Eastwood, ask him this question. Did he study the Jack Benny pause? Do you remember Jack Benny? If you're 200 years old, you probably do. But Jack Benny was a great comedian, but he had that moment where he paused and then the audience started laughing before he actually told the joke. He did it so well. One time he destroyed, in 1938, his own comedy, his own show, because his silence brought the audience down and they couldn't stop laughing. Maybe a better example, The First Godfather, the 3 films, I think is the best movie ever made. The character who is best, the best actor, is Robert Duvall. If you think back upon it, Robert Duvall is the only one who looks askance at the camera and without saying anything reveals everything that is on his mind and gives the audience the clue about what is about to happen. The others do not. The others are great characters too, but it's Duvall, the most silent of the whole cast, that I think actually energizes the plot. You get that sense. Do you remember the no one forgets it, the horse, in the bed? It's, a horrible scene. But before that happens, Robert Duvall's character, Tom is his name, is confronting this iniquitous and just a predatory movie director, and the movie director curses out Duvall's character, tells him to get off the lot, and Duvall picks up the director's arm by the wrist and fits his hand in the director's hand and says, "I need to get back to the New York and give the bad news to the Don. He always likes to hear it first." And he puts the fear of God in this poor fellow.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything. That was a great movie, and the silence and containment of that role by Duvall. As far as the audience knows, he's just agreeing and walking away, but that something really, really bad is going to happen. And when it does, that is a stunning moment in cinema, really is.
A lot of people are talking about just how well you write and describe places, and they're just asking if you actually go to certain places for inspiration, or if it's just your writing, and that's for both of you.
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Well, I think the big difference between the two of us is it's rare for me to linger over the physical aspect of a place. I mean, I've done it a few times, but for me, it's more about the people and their context in whatever small town they are, because I'm just fascinated by small town society in America, away from the coasts, where It is so like what you would expect in some ways and so unlike what you would expect. So it's people in context really that I'm most into. But that's a question I wanted to ask too to Jim. I mean, it is obviously all the cliches, lyrical, beautiful, this and that, but it is seems to me very much in the Southern tradition. Now, is that inescapable, or was that something that you joyfully jumped into as a choice?
Well, I think it's the latter. Louisiana, of course, is a unique state in that, in some way or another, because its culture is mixed. It's more Caribbean than Anglo-Saxon. It's emblematic in one fashion or another of every aspect of American history, and it's still there. You can put your hand on it. We lived on Bayou Teche. My family has lived right on the bayou since 1836. And in our front yard were trees that were 200 years old. And in the heartwood were buried these 58 caliber mini balls that had been fired there in 1863. You could put your hand on it, and it was always there. It was like you could just almost see the specters out there in the fog if you let your imagination have its way. But I think the South, which is by and large heavily influenced by Calvinism and very dark images about the next world. The point is, the traveling preacher, the great orator, was actually a very valuable asset. People like to be scared. And the oral traditions over the years just seem, they were all around me growing up. And so I knew stories that other people didn't know. And I think that I have a literary influence. I was heavily influenced by the naturalists, John Steinbeck in particular, certainly James T. Farrell. And I like what Lee said about the small town, a small society in context. And the character becomes in many ways an emanation of it. It's kind of a Darwinian notion. But I think that oftentimes literary art that is set too hard in concrete reflects all the heat and none of the foliage. And I think that's what Lee was saying. And, some of the best writing in America is about small town America, and of course, the Midwest in particular.
I'm going to do one more that I thought was kind of fun. Nancy says that she's reading The Jealous Kind right now and is spending a lot of time Googling the music that you wrote about. And she just wondered if you listen to music while you write, and will you share a playlist if you have one?
Yeah. What I think Lee's written quite a bit. I know.
Well, I love music. Music as a whole is up there with the essential things in my life. Absolutely. I could not live without it, but I do not listen to music when I'm working because I find two things wrong with it. Certainly if it has lyrics in it, half of your mind is absorbed with somebody else's genius. Just staggering, some songs in the economy and beauty of their writing. And I don't want to be comparing myself to that on a real-time basis. And also the rhythms, the pace and the rhythm, it has to be internally generated by me. I can't have it imposed. So I work in total silence. But having said that, music is my number one recreation. And I will listen to anything, anywhere. There's always something good. Unfortunately, I'm extremely old-fashioned in terms of technology. To be honest, I've got a computer here, as you can see, but I hate it and I really don't want it. And I certainly do not want to do any of that streaming or downloading. Those words just appall me. So I stick to physical media, and that is slower, but I love the ownership of, I have for the rest of my life now, access to an hour of somebody's creativity. And I don't need the internet for that. I just love that sensation.
Yeah, yes, I feel the same way. Jack Kerouac composed while he had jazz records blowing plaster out of the ceiling, but he's the only person I know who did that. I keep my guitar close by my typewriter, or the what do you call it, the keys, and I stop the sound of doors slamming all over the house. But I believe though that music and poetry and prose all have a common denominator. And I love the story, the classical Greek story of the music of the spheres. And I've always believed that a good writer, a good artist of any kind, is a good listener. Dialogue, for example, that all the good dialogue is right out there, but a person has to listen for it. And put it this way, William Wordsworth, I think, said something about the greatest poetry comes from people of humble origins. That's the term that he used. And that's it. It's the human voice, but you got to listen for it.
You do, and I feel that especially novel writing is similar to music in as much as it has a mood and a feel and a key, and it starts somewhere and it takes you to somewhere else, delivers you somewhere else after a period of time. I think there's a lot in common, and it always astonishes me how many writers love music and how many writers would love to be a musician. I certainly would. I would have much preferred to be a musician than a writer. It's just where your talent falls. You know, you can't necessarily choose.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I would like to have been a musician, but as I say, I think it took me almost 50 years to pick the wildwood flower. I'll tell you a little Jimmy Dickens joke. I don't know if you remember little Jimmy Dickens, famous country singer. This is a true story, though. He was recording a record in the studio there in Nashville, and there was a Time reporter there. And when the fellas stopped playing, the reporter said, "Well, Mr. Dickens, you surely have a nice band. Do your boys read music?" And little Jimmy said, "Yes, sir. Couple of them reads it, but it don't hurt their playing none." Serious. That says it.
Well, I think we're pretty much done. I just wanted to thank y'all again for being here and doing this. I think everybody really seemed to enjoy it.
Well, it's our pleasure.
Great hostess. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
And good luck to the bookstore, especially during these very, very weird times.
Yeah.
You know, we writers love, that's where you are right now. That's our number one sense of happiness. A good independent bookstore with people that know their community and cater to the community. It has a feel and an atmosphere that I just love, and I bitterly regret that we're not there in person, because right now I'd be ignoring you and checking out everything on the shelf and so on, because that is our life.
Yeah.
And, you know, what a shame that we haven't been able to do it. But on the other hand, these Facebook things are much easier to do. You know, nobody has to travel. We can have a lot of interesting conversations. So thank you very much for doing what you do, and thanks in particular for hosting this today.
Yes, this was great. I'm like you said, even though it's virtual, I'm just glad that we could have both of y'all back like this. And I was going to say, we've got signed copies of A Private Cathedral. We ship whatever. I'll put our website in the link, and then if you also want to pre-order Lee's book, we can do that as well.
And say hello to J.C. Peterson for me there.
Okay. Thank y'all so much. Y'all have a
Yeah.
good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Lee. Well, that was swell.
It was. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Lee. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure entirely. And please give my love to Pearl. Tell her it was. Do you remember we had dinner a couple of years ago? It was.
Oh, yeah, sure.
We'd love to do that again. And stay safe up there.
Well, same to you. All the best.
You bet. Bye.